The morning of March 4th, 1930 started like most mornings had for Earl Hutchins. He pulled on his coat in the dark, walked out past his henhouse, and stopped at the shed door. Inside sat his Fordson Model F, four-cylinder engine, around 2,700 pounds of cast iron and steel. The same machine he'd bought in 1925 on a payment plan he thought he could manage. He'd driven it through 5 harvests. He'd named it, probably. Farmers do that. By noon it was gone. A bank agent from the First National out of Wichita had the paperwork. Legal, clean, stamped in triplicate. Earl Hutchins was one of hundreds, maybe thousands, of farmers across the American Midwest who lost their Fordson that week. Not to flood, not to fire, to a piece of paper and a man in a suit who didn't know which end of a plow goes in the ground. To understand why 2,000 Fordson Model F tractors vanished from American farms in a single week during the spring of 1930, you have to understand what the Fordson was, what it meant, and how an entire generation of farmers got caught between the future and a collapsing economy with absolutely nowhere to go. The Fordson Model F was Henry Ford's answer to a question American farmers had been asking since the 1890s. The question was simple. When does the horse get replaced? The Model F hit production in 1917. At launch, it cost $750. Stripped down, low-slung, no frills. Compared to the massive steam-powered traction engines that required a crew of 5 in a water wagon just to operate, the Fordson was practically a toy. One man, one machine. 20 acres a day. It sold like nothing the agricultural world had ever seen. By 1920, Ford was producing over 100 Fordsons a day at his Dearborn plant. Farmers who'd spent their whole lives following a team of horses through clay soil suddenly had something that didn't need feeding on the off days and didn't spook at thunder. See that subscribe button? It's our exchange. Your way of saying, "This reached me." Not about the action size, but its meaning. Hit it if this resonated, drop a like if it moved you, and comment your thoughts on this story. Let's complete this circle together. Now, back to 1930. And back to the problem that was already building long before the stock market cracked. The 1920s were not kind to American farmers. That's the version of history that gets skipped when people talk about the Roaring '20s. The era that was supposedly all jazz clubs and rising markets. The prosperity didn't reach the fields. Grain prices had peaked during World War I and collapsed almost immediately after. Corn that sold for $1.50 a bushel in 1919 was fetching under 50 cents by 1921, and wheat dropped by more than half. The farmers who had borrowed against good wartime prices found themselves carrying debt that the land could no longer service. And yet, the Fordson kept selling. Banks were lending, manufacturers were extending credit terms. International Harvester was doing it. John Deere was doing it. And Ford, through various dealer arrangements, was doing it too. Buy now, pay later. Mechanize your operation or fall behind. The logic was hard to argue with. A Fordson could replace 3 to 4 draft horses. That's the feed bill, the farrier costs, and 3 years of shoeing wiped out. On paper, it made sense. In reality, it was a trap. By 1927, Ford had stopped American production of the Model F entirely, shifting manufacturing to Cork, Ireland, and later Dagenham, England. The American Fordson era was technically over, but thousands of those tractors were still working American fields, and thousands more were still being paid for. Yet the notes didn't disappear when production stopped. Then came October 1929. The crash didn't hit farmers all at once. For the men already deep in debt, the years before the crash had already been a slow disaster. But the market collapse froze credit. Banks that had been rolling over farm loans, accepting partial payments, tolerating arrears. Suddenly they weren't. Examiners came in. Portfolios were reviewed. Collateral was identified. The Fordson Model F was collateral. And in the loan documents signed by farmers across Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Iowa, and the Dakotas, The tractor was often listed by name and serial number as a secured asset. When the farmer stopped making payments, and by late 1929, hundreds of thousands of them had, the bank had the legal right to take it. Not the land, not always. The tractor. The one piece of equipment that made the difference between farming with your arms and farming with something that actually worked. And the week in question, that single, brutal 7-day span in March of 1930, was not the result of one bank acting alone. It was the convergence of dozens of institutions, from small county banks to regional lenders, all executing repossession orders that had been building for months. The Federal Reserve's tightening of credit in early 1930 accelerated the timeline. Banks that had been patient ran out of patience simultaneously. Field agents fanned out across the plains. Some arrived with sheriff's deputies. Some came alone with just the paperwork and a flatbed truck. The Fordson Model F, sitting at about 2,700 pounds, wasn't easy to move without its own cooperation. But it wasn't impossible. You could tow it. You could drive it up ramps if you got it running, and many of the agents knew exactly how to start a Fordson, because they'd been doing it all week. 2,000 tractors, in 7 days, across 6 states. The number is staggering when you think about the logistics. That's an average of nearly 285 repossessions per day. Multiple agents working multiple routes. Temporary lots and storage fields filling up outside county seats and rail depots. Rows of Fordsons parked in muddy fields, engine cowlings catching the March sun, waiting to be auctioned or transferred to creditors. For the farmers who watched it happen, the loss wasn't just mechanical. The Fordson had been the future. Yet it had been the thing that was supposed to change everything. That had changed everything for a few years. Losing it meant going back to horses, if you still had them, back to hand tools, back to watching your neighbor's field and knowing you couldn't match their pace. Some farmers didn't watch quietly. In Atchison County, Kansas, a group of 12 farmers blocked the road with their remaining equipment when an agent arrived for a third repossession in 2 days. No violence, no weapons. They simply parked a Fordson, a wagon, and a thresher across the lane and stood there. The agent left. He came back with a deputy 3 days later. The Fordson was taken anyway. That scene, or versions of it, played out across the region. The resistance was real but largely ineffective. The law was clear, and in 1930, the law ran with the banks. What happened to those 2,000 tractors? The answer is complicated and not entirely satisfying. Some were resold at auction, often to wealthier operations, larger farms, land companies, sometimes neighboring farmers who had somehow kept their credit intact. Some sat in storage so long that parts were stripped for other Fordsons still in service. A portion were exported, particularly to Canada and parts of South America, where agricultural mechanization was still expanding, and a used Model F could still fetch a reasonable price. A handful were simply abandoned when the cost of storage exceeded whatever the bank could recoup. Rust does the rest. The ripple effect lasted for years. Farms that lost their tractor in 1930 didn't recover mechanically until later in the decade, when New Deal programs and rural credit agencies began extending loans under different terms. By then, the Fordson Model F was increasingly obsolete. The industry had moved on to more capable machines with proper transmissions and better hydraulics. Some of those farmers never caught up. The Fordson itself lived on in export markets well into the 1940s. The design Ford had developed between 1917 and 1928 proved durable in ways even Ford hadn't fully anticipated. Irish and English farmers drove them through World War II. Versions of the platform were still being manufactured in the Soviet Union as late as the 1950s. The Soviets had licensed the design in 1923 and kept building their own variant, the Ford Zone Putilowets, long after Ford had moved to other things. Earl Hutchins, and every farmer like him, lost something that week that didn't have a clean replacement. The machine had arrived like a promise and left like a debt collected. That was the Fordson Model F in 1930, first in the door, first on the truck, The Depression had many faces. This was one of the quieter ones, a flatbed pulling away at noon, an empty shed, and a man standing in a Kansas field in March, looking at the ground. Becky, if this story moved you the way it moved us, hit that like button. Subscribe for more forgotten stories from the fields. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for keeping these memories alive.